Shabbat Shalom. If you are here in this sanctuary, that means that you either live or have experienced one of the noisiest places on earth. It's a relief to step off the streets into this sacred space, a refuge from the loud dissonance of New York City's daily landscape, wailing sirens, clanks and booms of construction, bursts of music blaring from cars. This is compounded by quiet, even silent noises. Phones shake and startle us, drawing us to news alerts shouting danger, and social media feeds punctuating doom. There are words and words and words, so many words. Ads rotating on bus shelters, gleaming from publicity trucks lining subway cars. Slogans scream from posters, signs, stickers, and stamps on sidewalks, lampposts, and building walls. New York, visually and audibly, feels just about as far from the setting of this week's Torah portion as one can get. Tomorrow morning, we unscroll our Torah and step Bamidbar into the desert wilderness. The landscape of our beginnings is everything that the city is not. Open, hushed, sparse. Unlike urban overstimulation, there is a seeming sameness to the sea of sands, and the palette of browns and yellows provides contrasts simple and stark to the sky's blanket of blue. The desert is often described by what it lacks: people, vibrancy, noise. But if we enter its shock of stillness, pause, and let the soundscape of our home habitats slip away, we will discover it contains a subtle sonorousness. A rich and varied quietude invites listening rather than the instinct to block out. We hear the rustling of shrubs touched by gentle breeze, gazelle hoofs click-clacking on rocks. Sages spanning the generations teach that God chose the desert as the site of revelation with a purpose. This is the place of space. This is the place where we learned to hear and to listen. Here, God first spoke to Moses through crackling flame. Here, God first spoke to us as a people, sealing us in loving relationship for all eternity. Before wedding us through Torah, God called us to attention with grandeur and tumult. Smoke tumbled from the Mount Sinai. The ground shook. Lightning cracked the skies. Shofar blasts rang clear over resounding thunder. Yet before all of that cacophony, there was utter, pure silence. Our sages teach, when God gave the Torah, no bird twittered, no bird's wings rippled the desert air, no ox bellowed, angels withheld song. The sea ceased its roar, not a creature stirred. The whole world was hushed into breathless silence, and from this quiet, a voice. Ani Adonai Elohechem. I am Adonai, your God. When I was a young rabbinic student nervous to teach a classroom of third graders, my mother, a skilled teacher, wisely advised me, if you want to get the students' attention, don't raise your voice. They will just raise theirs. Speak quietly and allow silence. They will hear it and they will listen. It's like what Rabbi Jonathan Sachs taught. The silence that counts in Judaism is a listening silence, and listening is the supreme religious art Listening means making space for others to speak and be heard. Making space for others to speak and be heard. Elijah stood in the wilderness and heard God not in the screaming whistle of a whirlwind or the tumbling crash of an earthquake, but in the kol damimah daka, the sound of a slender silence, one that was barely a wisp. If Elijah hadn't quieted himself and attuned his soul toward listening, he wouldn't have heard God's voice. Making space for others to speak and be heard. Imagine if we could do that. Hearing God's voice feels nearly impossible right now at this time when we can barely hear each other, when we only see our own truth and leave no room to see and hear others. We use our words to convince instead of converse, hurling them at each other as weapons instead of offering them as invitations to engage, to learn, to grow. Last week at my daughter's graduation from Hunter's Silberstein School of Social Work, protesters in the audience drowned out the dean as she struggled to raise her voice in praise for the students. And when graduates crossed the stage to accept their diploma, unfurling flags and signs, some of the crowds clapped and cheered, making it impossible for the next student's name to be heard. I wondered what they would be feeling if it was their child whose name wasn't heard after working so hard for that diploma. It pains me to say that this even happens in sacred spaces. At a gathering last week of Reformed clergy and Jewish professionals, the president of Hebrew Union College was invited to respond to a suggestion that the Reformed seminary only ordain students who declare themselves as Zionists. Dr. Andrew Rayfeld calmly expressed his approach towards cultivating commitment to Israel, the Jewish people, or as he said, to any worthy idea. He believes that the seminary's role is to challenge students to grapple with a multitude of perspectives in an environment where everyone can be comfortable to ask questions and share their views without threat of expulsion. As he spoke, Dr. Rayfeld was booed by clergy in a synagogue. I resonate with the concern of Dr. Carol Christ, UC Berkeley's chancellor, who recently expressed her fear at people silencing others, often aggressively. It's student against student, she said, faculty member against faculty member, staff member against staff member. I've come to realize that while freedom of speech is an absolute, just because you have the right to say something doesn't mean it's right to say. If you value your community, you have to find ways of sharing your views that are not vitriolic, that are not needlessly hurtful to other people. I have no doubt that the protesters at Hunter's graduation were likely driven by empathy, horrified by the tragic and ongoing loss of life in Gaza. I have no doubt that my colleagues who booed Dr. Rayfeld are devastated by global anti-Semitism, the suffering caused by terrorism, and the assault on Israel's security. But when empathy and grief lead us to lash out, to build walls, to refuse to hear, we need to step into the desert of our soul and make space. Listening means making space for others to speak and be heard. We don't need to shout at a rally to drown out people with ideas different from ours. The process of silencing can be far more subtle than that. So many of us, myself included, spend hours and hours confining ourselves into self-erected silos of information. We listen to voices from around the globe, which ironically only serve to make our worldview smaller. Often this not only narrows our vision, but fuels our anger and our fear, often driving us away from neighbors, friends, family, colleagues, clergy, whose ideas and priorities might differ from ours. I have been working to recognize when I do this. Perhaps you will join me in this effort. When we catch ourselves returning to the comfort of our echo chambers, let's move to the desert of our souls. The echo of a canyon in the wilderness breathes space and broadens perspective with wide reverberation that greets possibility. Any small sound gets caught up in the circulating air and surrounds us, causing us to hear from every direction. As the composer John Luther Adams said, our listening animates the world, and the world listens back. Moroccan-Israeli poet Erez Biton immigrated to Israel with his parents as a young child. When he was 10, playing in a field, he accidentally detonated a hand bomb, ripping off his left arm, scarring his face, and leaving him blind. He went on to become one of Israel's most loved poets, known as the father of the Mizrahi poetry tradition. One day, he and Yehuda Amichai, the great Ashkenazi Israeli poet, and among the first to recognize Biton's talent, offered a joint poetry reading in Arad, a city bordering the Negev and Judean deserts. As the two poets shared a cab ride home, Biton asked Amichai to describe for him the essence of the desert that his friend was watching through the window. Amichai paused, then reached out and held Biton's hand for a few moments, saying nothing. Biton responded, "Now I understand." Biton later wrote a poem inspired by this encounter entitled Speaking Desert. Speaking Desert. Your silent hand charted desert oases for me, green upon green, as with communicating vessels, a hand touches a hand. Through your eyes, I saw the greatness of the word inscribed in stone and the wonder of the burning bush. Years later, after Amichai's death, when Biton was awarded the Amichai Prize for Hebrew Poetry, he shared this story. After the ceremony, Amichai's widow surprised Biton by revealing that Amichai, too, had captured that meaningful moment in a poem. Once I traveled along the shores of the Dead Sea with a blind poet. I wanted to describe the sights to him, and I was quiet. He saw. He understood. Two masters of verse, leaving words behind, drawing close in the sonorous silence of the desert. Through a touch, the seeing man enabled the blind man to see, to understand the extraordinary wonder of the desert. Without speaking, he brought Biton to moments of divine revelation, echoing eternally in that wilderness. In silence, together they heard God's voice. And the blind man was the seeing man's prophet. He allowed Amichai, renowned and celebrated for his use of language, to be without words, without any shame or need to produce. He gave him space to simply be. And in response, Amichai went to what is most essential, even from the world's most gifted poet: being present, reaching out, connecting. What seems to us to be true almost always stands beside other truths that we don't always want to recognize. The desert appears arid and void, a deserted and silent wasteland, but if we step into it, remain quiet, and stay patient, we will discover strains of sound, lessons for listening, and a path towards being present. What appears barren landscape is a springboard for the fullness of life. What seems solitary cultivates connection and community. This sprawling space of the desert joins us to the voices of people in our past who speak to us still, to the voice of God who speaks to us always. If only we would quiet ourselves, make space, and listen.